The case was closed in less than 24 hours. By the next morning, officials were already speaking in past tense, as if the truth had been settled. A suspect identified, a narrative agreed upon, paperwork signed. The system moved forward with confidence, efficiency, and speed that looked impressive from the outside. To the public, it felt reassuring. A crime solved quickly. No loose ends. No lingering fear. But speed has a cost. Because when a case closes that fast, there is no time for doubt, and doubt is where the truth usually lives. Inside those first 24 hours, decisions were made under pressure. Investigators faced expectations from superiors. Prosecutors faced timelines. Officials faced the unspoken demand to deliver answers before questions had time to form. And in that rush, the system didn't just overlook details, it filtered them out. Not because the evidence didn't exist, but because it didn't fit. Critical evidence was present from the beginning. It appeared in early statements. It surfaced in raw files. It lingered at the edges of reports, acknowledged briefly, then quietly dismissed. Not flagged as urgent. Not pursued. Not tested. Once a case is declared closed, every piece of information after that moment is judged by a single standard. Does it support the conclusion? If it doesn't, it becomes invisible. This documentary isn't about a dramatic last-minute confession or a shocking courtroom reversal. It's about something far more common and far more dangerous. It's about how systems built to deliver justice can sometimes mistake certainty for accuracy, and how the need to move forward can outweigh the responsibility to slow down. Because the most important errors don't happen years later. They happen at the beginning. In the first interviews. In the first assumptions. In the first version of the story that everyone agrees not to question. What makes this case different isn't just what was missed, it's how easily it was missed. How routine the oversights were. How normal the shortcuts felt. And how quickly the system rewarded itself for moving fast instead of moving carefully. The evidence didn't vanish. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't hidden in a locked room. It was ignored. And once the file was stamped complete, challenging that decision became almost impossible. Witnesses were never recontacted. Leads were never reopened. Alternate explanations were labeled unlikely before they were ever examined. The story hardened into fact, not because it was proven, but because it was already written. This is the quiet danger of speed. When a case closes too fast, it doesn't leave room for truth to argue back. In this documentary, we go inside that first day, hour by hour, to examine how a conclusion was reached so quickly and why critical evidence failed to slow it down. We look at what was prioritized, what was dismissed, and what questions were never asked because the system believed it already had the answers. Because once a case is closed, reopening it doesn't just challenge the evidence. It challenges the credibility of everyone involved. And that may be the hardest truth of all. The system didn't miss the evidence because it wasn't there. It missed it because the case was already over. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The first 24 hours of any criminal case are supposed to be the most fragile. This is the window where facts are incomplete, emotions are unstable, and assumptions can easily masquerade as truth. Investigators are trained to treat this period with caution, to move deliberately, question early impressions, and resist the temptation to lock onto a single explanation too quickly. That is not what happened here. From the moment the call came in, the case began moving toward resolution at a speed that left little room for doubt. Patrol officers arrived, secured the scene, and began documenting what they saw. Supervisors followed. Detectives were notified early. Within hours, the investigation had momentum, not just activity, but direction. The scene itself did not immediately suggest complexity. There were no obvious signs of prolonged struggle, no scattered trail of evidence stretching across multiple locations. To experienced eyes, it looked manageable. The kind of case that, with efficiency and coordination, could be wrapped up quickly. That early perception mattered. Because once a scene is categorized as straightforward, the investigation that follows often reflects that assumption. Officers focus on confirming what seems most likely rather than exploring what remains uncertain. From the beginning, the case was treated less like an open question and more like a problem waiting for a clean solution. Initial reports were written quickly. They were factual, but not neutral. No report ever truly is. Each description reflects judgment, what is emphasized, what is condensed, what is left for later. Small decisions made in these first hours would quietly shape everything that followed. Witnesses were interviewed while memories were fresh, but also while shock and stress distorted perception. Timelines were estimated rather than measured. Details conflicted. These inconsistencies were expected, but instead of triggering caution, they were smoothed over. Stress was used as an explanation. Confusion was treated as noise rather than signal. As interviews accumulated, an internal narrative began to form. It wasn't official yet, and it wasn't written down, but it was understood. A suspect profile emerged early, shaped by familiarity and pattern recognition rather than exhaustive elimination. Investigators relied on experience, the mental shortcuts that help professionals make sense of chaos under pressure. These shortcuts are not malicious. They are human. But once a suspect takes shape in the mind, the investigation subtly changes. Evidence is no longer evaluated in isolation. It is judged by how well it fits the emerging story. Leads that align are pursued with urgency. Leads that challenge the narrative are treated with skepticism or quietly deprioritized. By the midpoint of the first day, the system was already leaning toward closure. Supervisory pressure increased. Updates were requested. Timelines were refined. Prosecutors were consulted earlier than usual, signaling that attention was shifting from investigation to outcome. The case was no longer just about understanding what happened. It was about preparing for what came next. This is where speed becomes dangerous. Because speed creates confidence, and confidence discourages doubt. Several pieces of information surfaced during these early hours that did not align perfectly with the developing narrative. They were not dramatic contradictions. They were subtle inconsistencies, timing issues, ambiguous observations, small details that suggested alternative possibilities without clearly pointing to a different conclusion. Under different circumstances, these details might have slowed the investigation. Here, they were noted and set aside. Part of the problem was structural. Patrol officers saw the scene but left early. Detectives worked from summaries rather than raw experience. Supervisors reviewed conclusions rather than uncertainty. Each layer of the system filtered information further, reducing complexity with every step. By the time anyone had the authority to challenge the direction, the story was already solidifying. Language and internal reports reflected this shift. Terms like likely, consistent with, and appears to indicate carried increasing weight. Once uncertainty is framed this way, it rarely returns to the category of unknown. Assumptions quietly harden into facts. The suspect was questioned. The interview followed protocol, but its purpose was revealing. Questions were designed to clarify details within the assumed narrative rather than challenge its foundation. When answers aligned, confidence increased. When they didn't, follow-ups guided the conversation back toward coherence. This is how critical evidence begins to disappear, not physically, but conceptually. Information that complicates a story demands time, resources, and justification. In a system already leaning toward closure, complexity becomes a liability. So complexity was minimized. By hour 18, internal communication reflected certainty. Discussions moved from what happened to how to proceed. Attention shifted toward documentation, charging decisions, and public messaging. The first public narrative was prepared. Once a case is presented to the public as solved, revising it becomes difficult. Clarifications look like corrections. Corrections look like mistakes. And mistakes invite scrutiny. The safest path forward becomes defending the original conclusion. When the case was formally closed within 24 hours, it was not because every avenue had been exhausted. It was because the system achieved what it values most under pressure, resolution. But closure is not truth. The speed of the outcome created an illusion of thoroughness. To outsiders, it looked efficient. Internally, it felt like success. Yet beneath that surface, critical work remained unfinished. Certain evidence had not been fully analyzed. Certain leads had not been followed to their natural end. Certain inconsistencies had been acknowledged but never reconciled. These were not failures of competence. They were failures of priority. Once a case is closed, reopening it requires justification. It requires new information. It requires someone willing to challenge an existing conclusion, and by extension, the people who made it. Most systems resist that kind of friction. So the case settled. Files were archived. Attention moved on. Resources shifted elsewhere. The unanswered questions of the first day faded into the background, not because they were resolved, but because the system decided it was finished listening. But evidence does not operate on institutional timelines. It waits. The tragedy of the first 24 hours is not that mistakes were made. Mistakes are inevitable. The tragedy is that the system did not leave itself room to correct them. By moving quickly, it traded flexibility for finality. And in doing so, it set the foundation for everything that followed. Because when a system convinces itself it is done, it stops questioning. And the evidence missed during those first hours would later demand to be heard. A case does not truly end when it is closed. It ends when the system decides there is no longer a reason to listen. In the days immediately following the official closure, nothing dramatic happened. There were no objections, no internal alarms, no sudden discoveries that forced reconsideration. On paper, the case moved exactly as it was supposed to. Files were completed. Reports were finalized. The conclusion was entered into record. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. The tone inside the system changed almost overnight. Where there had once been open discussion, there was now quiet alignment. Where there had been questions, there were now summaries. The work was no longer investigative, it was administrative. The goal was no longer understanding, but consistency. This transition is subtle, but it is one of the most important moments in any criminal case. Because the moment a case closes, doubt becomes inconvenient. Before closure, doubt has value. It fuels inquiry. It justifies delay. It creates space for alternative explanations. After closure, doubt threatens stability. It raises uncomfortable questions. It implies that something might have been rushed, missed, or misunderstood. And systems are not designed to welcome that implication. In the early days after the closure, some of the individuals who had worked the case began to feel that discomfort. Not strongly enough to object, not clearly enough to articulate, but enough to notice. Certain details lingered in memory. Timelines that had seemed acceptable under pressure now felt less precise. Decisions that had been made quickly began to feel permanent. These were not formal concerns. They were instincts. And instincts, in institutional environments, have no authority unless they are converted into documentation. To raise a concern formally requires more than uncertainty. It requires justification. It requires evidence that can withstand scrutiny. And most importantly, it requires the willingness to challenge a conclusion that has already been accepted. That willingness is rare. Because once a conclusion is accepted, it becomes more than a finding. It becomes a reflection of competence, of professionalism, of judgment. Questioning it is no longer just about the case. It is about the people who closed it. This is where systems begin to protect themselves. One of the earliest signs of this protection appeared in how the timeline was treated. The official timeline was tight. It needed to be. The conclusion depended on a specific sequence of events unfolding within a narrow window. That window made the narrative clean, logical, defensible. But early witness statements had never fully supported that precision. Some witnesses placed key events earlier than the official account allowed. Others recalled delays or pauses that disrupted the flow. These inconsistencies were not dramatic contradictions, but they mattered. They introduced elasticity into a narrative that depended on rigidity. Before closure, those inconsistencies were acknowledged as unresolved. After closure, they were reframed as insignificant. This reframing did not require falsification. It required selection. Statements that aligned with the official timeline were emphasized. Statements that didn't were attributed to stress, confusion, or faulty memory. The witnesses themselves were not discredited outright. They were simply deprioritized. This process felt reasonable. It felt professional. It felt necessary. But it had a consequence. Once credibility is assigned this way, it becomes self-reinforcing. A statement is reliable because it fits. It fits because it is considered reliable. Anything that challenges the structure is quietly excluded, not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. This pattern extended beyond witness testimony. Physical evidence followed the same path. Several items collected early in the investigation had not been analyzed before the case was closed. This was not unusual. Labs have backlogs. Priorities are assigned based on need. But in this case, the need diminished the moment the conclusion was reached. When results eventually came back, They were evaluated through the lens of a settled narrative. Findings that were consistent were treated as confirmation. Findings that raised questions were labeled inconclusive. Inconclusive became a shield. It allowed evidence to exist without forcing interpretation. It suggested that nothing definitive had been missed, even when nothing definitive had been resolved. It preserved confidence while avoiding confrontation. Over time, the case began to take on a different role inside the system. It became an example of efficiency, an example of coordination, an example of how quickly a case could be resolved when everyone worked together. That framing mattered, because examples are not meant to be questioned. They are meant to be repeated. As months passed, the people most familiar with the uncertainty of the early hours moved on to other cases. New personnel encountered the case only through summaries and conclusions. To them, the outcome was not the result of a process. It was a fact. This generational shift is one of the most powerful forces in institutional memory. When knowledge is passed down without uncertainty, it hardens. Doubt disappears not because it has been resolved, but because it has not been inherited. Yet the unresolved elements did not disappear entirely. They resurfaced quietly. A comment during a review meeting. A hesitation when explaining the timeline to someone new. A moment where a question was asked and then not pursued. These moments did not alter the official record, but they accumulated. And accumulation changes pressure. The first significant friction came not from an internal challenge, but from routine administrative review. A secondary look triggered by process, not suspicion. Fresh eyes, unfamiliar with the urgency of the original decision, reconstructed the case from primary materials rather than conclusions. They noticed things others had stopped seeing. The timeline looked less stable when rebuilt from raw statements. Certain assumptions stood out clearly as assumptions, not facts. The speed of closure appeared less like efficiency and more like compression. These observations were not accusations. They were questions, and questions are dangerous after closure. The response was careful, measured, appropriate. The concerns were acknowledged, then contextualized. Yes, the timeline had required interpretation. Yes, some details had been unclear. But the overall conclusion remained sound. The inconsistencies were framed as normal artifacts of complex situations. Nothing rose to the level of requiring action. This response was not dishonest. It was defensive, because reopening the case would not simply require examining evidence. It would require revisiting decisions, justifying why the case had been closed so quickly, explaining why certain paths had not been taken. An explanation invites exposure. So the scope of review was limited. Questions were answered narrowly. The goal was reassurance, not reevaluation. This is how systems contain doubt, not by denying it outright, but by managing its boundaries. As time passed, the cost of reopening the case increased. Memories faded. Witnesses became harder to locate. Context was lost. Recreating the conditions of the first day became impossible. Time worked in favor of the conclusion. Evidence does not argue. It does not insist. It does not demand attention. It simply exists, waiting for someone willing to look at it without needing it to say a specific thing. For a long time after the case was closed, no one did. Not because the evidence was inaccessible, not because it had been lost or destroyed, but because acknowledging it required something the system was increasingly unwilling to offer: openness to being wrong. The earliest signs of trouble did not arrive as revelations. They arrived as discomfort. Files that felt incomplete. Timelines that worked on paper but collapsed under scrutiny. Details that had been smoothed over so thoroughly they no longer felt real. These were not dramatic discoveries. They were quiet irritations, the kind that professionals learn to suppress in order to function. But suppression does not erase doubt. It only postpones it. What changed was not the evidence itself, but the context around it. As time passed, the case began to intersect with other processes, audits, reviews, cross-checks unrelated to its original investigation. These moments brought new eyes, new standards, and new questions. And unlike the original investigators, these reviewers had no emotional or professional investment in the speed of the closure. They were not looking to defend a conclusion. They were looking for coherence. One of the first things they noticed was the way the evidence had been framed. Much of it had been summarized rather than presented in full. Witness statements condensed. Observations paraphrased. Ambiguity resolved through language rather than analysis. This is common practice, and in many cases it works. But here, the compression had consequences. When raw materials were compared to their summarized versions, subtle shifts appeared. Nuance had been lost. Conditional statements had become definitive. Uncertainty had been translated into confidence. None of this amounted to misconduct, but it did amount to distortion. The timeline was the most fragile element. Reconstructed carefully, without relying on the official narrative as a guide, it began to stretch. Events overlapped in ways they shouldn't have. Certain actions appeared to require more time than the official version allowed. Other moments depended on assumptions that had never been verified. This did not immediately point to a different conclusion, but it weakened the existing one. And weakness, in a closed case, is dangerous, because a weak conclusion requires defense, and defense draws attention. As these issues surfaced, the system responded in familiar ways. Clarifications were issued. Explanations were offered. Alternative interpretations were acknowledged, then set aside. Each response addressed the concern without expanding the scope of inquiry. The goal was containment. But containment only works if the pressure remains localized. It didn't. The more the evidence was examined, the more it resisted simplification. Pieces that had seemed independent began to interact. Minor inconsistencies reinforced one another. Assumptions stacked on assumptions until the structure no longer felt stable. What had once been dismissed as noise began to resemble a pattern. This is the moment when evidence becomes critical, not because it reveals a new answer, but because it destabilizes the old one. Still, no formal action was taken. Formal action requires justification that can survive scrutiny. It requires something concrete, something undeniable. And the evidence, while troubling, remained interpretive. Interpretation is easy to dismiss. So the system waited. But evidence does not respond to waiting. It continued to surface in indirect ways. A delayed lab result that raised questions rather than closing them. A reread statement that now seemed oddly phrased. A procedural step that appeared to have been skipped, not intentionally, but casually. Each discovery was small, but together, they changed the tone. Conversations shifted again. Not back to investigation, not yet, but away from certainty. Language softened. Confidence was replaced with caution. Where people had once said this happened, they now said it appears that. That shift mattered, because language signals permission. And permission is what allows doubt to exist. At this stage, the case occupied an uncomfortable space. It was closed, but no longer settled. Defended, but not trusted. Maintained, but increasingly fragile. The people closest to the evidence began to recognize the problem. Reopening the case would be disruptive, but not reopening it carried its own risk. Because unresolved evidence does not remain neutral. Left unaddressed, it accumulates meaning. One of the most troubling realizations came from revisiting early decision points. Choices that had seemed reasonable under pressure now appeared consequential. Leads that had been deprioritized early on were never truly reevaluated. Alternatives dismissed in the first hours had never been tested against later information. The speed of closure had not just shaped the outcome, it had defined the boundaries of inquiry. And those boundaries were now visible. This realization did not produce consensus. Some argued the case still held, that the inconsistencies were explainable, that reopening it would cause more harm than clarity. Others were less certain. But certainty was no longer unanimous. That fracture is significant, because systems rely on shared confidence. Once that confidence breaks, even quietly, stability erodes. The debate was never public. It unfolded in private discussions, cautious emails, carefully worded notes. No one wanted to be responsible for reopening the case, but no one wanted to be responsible for ignoring the evidence either. Responsibility became diffuse, and diffuse responsibility leads to delay. Delay allowed time to pass, and time, once again, worked against resolution. Witnesses became harder to reach. Context faded. Evidence aged. The window for clean correction closed. What remained was a choice between two imperfect options. Maintain a conclusion increasingly difficult to defend, or reopen a case with no guarantee of clarity. Neither option was appealing, but the evidence had begun to speak louder, not through revelation, but through persistence. It refused to align neatly. It refused to disappear. And the more it was ignored, the more conspicuous it became. This is the moment when systems often fail, not because they lack information, but because they lack the structure to respond to uncertainty once finality has been declared. As Chapter 3 closes, the case stands at a threshold. The evidence has not delivered a new story, but it has undermined the old one. The system has not admitted error, but it has lost confidence. And in that space, between doubt and denial, the pressure continues to build. Because evidence does not need to shout. It only needs time. Institutions do not panic the way people do. They do not react emotionally. They do not lash out. They do not admit fear. Instead, they close ranks. By the time the evidence began to feel impossible to ignore, the case had already moved beyond the realm of investigation and into something far more sensitive: institutional credibility. What was at stake was no longer just the accuracy of a conclusion, but the integrity of the process that produced it. And systems will protect process before they protect truth. The first visible response to growing pressure was procedural. Meetings became more structured, communications more formal, language more careful. Where earlier discussions had been exploratory, now they were controlled. Agendas were set. Scope was defined in advance. Questions were allowed, but only within boundaries. This shift was not announced. It did not need to be. Everyone felt it. The case was no longer something to be examined. It was something to be managed. One of the most important changes occurred in how responsibility was framed. Early on, decisions had been understood as collective, the result of collaboration under pressure. Now, those same decisions were reframed as reasonable judgments based on the information available at the time. This reframing served a purpose. If decisions were reasonable, they did not need to be revisited. If they did not need to be revisited, the case did not need to be reopened. If the case did not need to be reopened, the system remained intact. This logic became the quiet foundation of every subsequent action. Requests for clarification were redirected. Concerns were acknowledged but deferred. Questions were answered with references to policy, precedent, and standard practice. The emphasis was no longer on what the evidence suggested, but on whether procedures had been followed. And in many respects, they had. That is what made this moment so difficult. There was no single violation to point to, no obvious misconduct, no dramatic error that demanded correction. The system had operated within its rules, just not within its ideals. This distinction matters, because systems are designed to defend rules, not ideals. As scrutiny increased, documentation became the primary shield. Reports were cited, logs referenced, decisions justified through timelines and protocols. The more questions arose, the thicker the paper trail became. Paper creates authority. Once something is written, approved, and filed, it takes on a permanence that evidence alone does not. Challenging it requires not just disagreement, but proof strong enough to overcome documentation. And documentation favors those who wrote it first. The original narrative, established within the first 24 hours, now carried the weight of time. It had been repeated, referenced, and reinforced. Undoing it would require more than doubt. It would require something disruptive. Disruption is dangerous, because disruption attracts attention. And attention invites scrutiny not just of the case, but of the institution itself. This is the point where self-preservation becomes explicit, not in words, but in action. Access to information became more controlled. Requests for raw materials were met with summaries. Reviews were conducted internally rather than independently. The scope of inquiry was defined narrowly enough to avoid destabilizing conclusions. This was not obstruction. It was containment. Containment is subtle. It operates through structure rather than resistance. It gives the appearance of cooperation while limiting impact. And it is remarkably effective. Those raising concerns found themselves navigating a maze of process. Requests required approval. Approval required justification. Justification required evidence. And evidence, by this point, was already filtered. The system did not say no. It said not yet. Not here. Not this way. Not without more. This delay served a purpose. Time erodes urgency. Urgency fuels action. Without urgency, doubt loses momentum. Meanwhile, the public narrative remained unchanged. From the outside, the case appeared resolved. There were no updates, no reversals, no indications of internal conflict. Silence conveyed confidence. Confidence reassured. And reassurance is powerful, because it discourages further questioning. Internally, however, the strain was growing. Individuals involved in later reviews began to feel the weight of implication. To push further would mean crossing a line, not a formal one, but a cultural one. It would mean challenging not just a conclusion, but the authority of those who made it. Hierarchy matters. In institutional settings, truth does not move freely upward. It must pass through layers of approval, interpretation, and risk assessment. Each layer filters not just information, but consequence. By the time doubt reaches the top, it has often been diluted beyond recognition. Those closest to the evidence understood this. They also understood the cost of persistence. Careers stall quietly. Reputations shift subtly. People become difficult, overly cautious, not team players. None of this is written down, but everyone knows. This implicit pressure is one of the most effective tools systems possess. It does not require orders. It requires culture. And culture enforces compliance more reliably than rules ever could. At the same time, the system faced a paradox. The more it defended the original conclusion, the more fragile that conclusion became. Each clarification invited new questions. Each explanation exposed additional assumptions. Defense created exposure. But retreat was no longer an option. Admitting uncertainty now would raise the obvious question: why wasn't this addressed sooner? And that question would lead directly back to the first 24 hours. Back to speed. Back to pressure. Back to decisions made too quickly. The system could not afford to revisit that moment. So it doubled down. Internal language shifted again. Where earlier communication had acknowledged complexity, it now emphasized closure. The case was described as thoroughly reviewed, appropriately handled, consistent with established practice. These phrases carry weight. They do not claim perfection. They claim legitimacy. And legitimacy is often enough. As months passed, the opportunity for meaningful correction diminished. Witnesses became unreachable. Memories faded. Context evaporated. Even if the case were reopened, it would no longer be the same case. This reality became part of the defense. Reopening it now would not bring clarity, only confusion. Better to maintain stability than introduce uncertainty. This argument is persuasive. It is also circular, because the only reason reopening would be difficult is that it was delayed. But systems rarely acknowledge circular reasoning. They operate on precedent, not reflection. By this stage, the case existed in a suspended state, officially resolved, internally contested, structurally protected, practically immovable, and yet the evidence remained. Not loud, not decisive, but persistent. It lingered in files, in annotations, in questions that had been answered without satisfaction. It did not force action, but it prevented comfort. This is where pressure becomes consequence, not through explosion, but through erosion. Trust erodes. Confidence erodes. Certainty erodes. The system had closed ranks, but it had also trapped itself. Because the more it focused on protecting the conclusion, the less room it had to respond if that conclusion ultimately failed. Every closed system believes it can manage the consequences of its decisions. It believes that if enough structure is built around a conclusion, enough reports, enough approvals, enough internal agreement, then that conclusion will hold, even if it is imperfect. What systems often underestimate is the cost of maintaining that stability over time. Because certainty is expensive, and the longer it must be defended, the higher the cost becomes. By the time the case reached this stage, the issue was no longer evidence alone. It was reputation, authority, trust. The question was no longer what happened, but what happens if we are wrong. That question changes behavior. It narrows options. It raises stakes. It turns uncertainty into risk. Inside the institution, the case began to acquire a different gravity. It was no longer discussed casually. It appeared less frequently on agendas, but when it did, the conversations were tense, controlled, deliberate. Every word felt measured, because words now carried consequence. Those who had been present during the first 24 hours understood what was at stake better than anyone. They remembered the pressure, the speed, the assumptions. They knew how quickly the conclusion had taken shape, and they knew that revisiting it would mean revisiting themselves. This is the part of institutional failure that is hardest to confront. Error does not feel abstract when it is personal. To acknowledge that the case may have been mishandled would mean admitting that judgment had been compromised, not by negligence or malice, but by urgency, by confidence, by the belief that moving fast was the right thing to do. That admission threatens more than pride. It threatens credibility. And credibility is the currency systems trade in. As pressure increased, the system's responses became more defensive, not in tone, but in strategy. Communication narrowed further. Decisions about the case were elevated to higher levels, further removed from the evidence itself. The people making calls now were often those least familiar with the original uncertainty. Distance created insulation. At the same time, external pressure began to build. Not dramatically, not publicly, but incrementally. Questions from outside the immediate institution became more frequent. Requests for clarification. Inquiries framed as routine. Interest that could no longer be dismissed as curiosity. Each inquiry required a response. Each response required justification. And justification required repeating the narrative. The more often the narrative was repeated, the more fragile it became. Because repetition invites comparison. Different versions of the same explanation were examined side by side. Slight inconsistencies in phrasing stood out. Emphasis shifted subtly depending on audience. What had once been a single story began to fragment. This fragmentation did not prove the case was wrong, but it proved it was being managed. Inside the institution, this was recognized as a danger. Managing perception can be effective in the short term, but it creates exposure in the long term. The more effort spent controlling the narrative, the less resilient that narrative becomes. Still, no one wanted to be the first to break. Breaking means acting, and acting means consequence. For those lower in the hierarchy, the risk was personal. Raising concerns could stall careers, isolate relationships, and mark them as liabilities rather than assets. For those higher up, the risk was institutional. Reopening the case would signal failure, not just of an investigation, but of leadership. So responsibility continued to diffuse. Everyone waited for someone else to move. This waiting had a cost. Because while institutions delay, reality continues. Memories faded. Physical evidence aged. Context dissolved. The opportunity for a clean correction slipped further away. Even if the system chose to act, the damage of delay would complicate everything. This reality was quietly acknowledged in internal discussions. Reopening the case now would be messy, incomplete, uncertain, and uncertainty, again, was the enemy. So the system leaned harder on one final defense, inevitability. The argument took shape slowly, then solidified. Even if mistakes were made, correcting them now would not bring clarity. Even if evidence was overlooked, it could no longer be fully recovered. Even if the conclusion was flawed, reopening the case would cause more harm than good. This reasoning is powerful. It reframes inaction as responsibility. It suggests that stability is preferable to truth when truth arrives too late. And in many systems, that logic wins. But inevitability has a flaw. It assumes that the cost of action will always exceed the cost of inaction. That assumption rarely holds, because inaction accumulates its own cost. As time passed, the case became harder to explain succinctly. Simple questions required long answers. Straightforward requests triggered complex reviews. What had once been a model of efficiency now demanded careful handling. This complexity did not go unnoticed. Confidence, once so easy, became performative. And performance is exhausting. Those tasked with defending the case felt the strain. Meetings dragged. Explanations grew defensive. The same points were revisited repeatedly, each time with less conviction. What had once been certainty was now maintenance. At the edges of the system, trust began to erode. Not collapse. Erosion is quieter than that. People became cautious, less willing to speak confidently about the case, more likely to hedge. Hedging signals weakness, and weakness attracts attention. This is where systems often miscalculate. They believe that silence preserves stability. In reality, silence creates space for speculation, for external scrutiny, for narratives beyond their control. The case had not exploded, but it was no longer contained. And containment had always been the strategy. As Chapter 5 reaches its end, the system faces a narrowing path. The longer it delays decisive action, the fewer options remain. What once could have been corrected quietly now threatens to surface loudly. The evidence has not changed. The doubts have not disappeared. The narrative remains, but it is under strain. The cost of being wrong is no longer theoretical. It is practical, reputational, structural, and the system can feel it. Because the most dangerous moment for any institution is not when it is exposed. It is when it realizes that exposure may be inevitable and still cannot agree on how to respond. The case is still officially closed, but the space around that closure is collapsing, and something has to give. The case was closed in 24 hours. On paper, it remains that way. No reversal, no public correction, no official admission that anything went wrong. And yet, everything we've seen tells a different story. What happened here was not a dramatic failure. There was no single moment where the system collapsed or a clear line where truth was deliberately ignored. Instead, this case shows something far more common and far more dangerous. It shows how speed can replace scrutiny, how confidence can harden into certainty, how closure can become a substitute for truth. The system did not miss the evidence because it wasn't there. It missed it because the case moved too fast to let the evidence matter. And once that momentum took hold, every step afterward made it harder to slow down, harder to question, and harder to correct. By the time doubts became impossible to ignore, the cost of acknowledging them had grown too high. Reputation was at stake. Authority was at stake. Trust was at stake. And when systems are forced to choose between stability and uncertainty, they almost always choose stability, even if that stability rests on fragile ground. This story is not unique. It is not rare. It is not about one case, one decision, or one institution. It is about a pattern that repeats wherever speed is rewarded more than accuracy, and where closing the file matters more than getting it right. The most unsettling truth is this. Once a case is officially closed, reopening it becomes less about evidence and more about courage. Courage to admit uncertainty. Courage to revisit decisions. Courage to accept that moving fast does not always mean moving forward. The evidence in this case never disappeared. It waited, quietly, patiently, indifferent to confidence or denial. Because evidence doesn't need permission to exist, it only needs time. And time has a way of exposing what certainty tries to hide. This documentary isn't asking for outrage. It isn't demanding a verdict. It's asking a simpler, more uncomfortable question. When the system decides it's finished listening, who is left to speak for the truth? Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.